Witajcie na Brodach z Kosmosu. Kolejny gość przed nami, John Higgins, znany z tak wielu rzeczy, ale przede wszystkim Batman, sędzia Dredd oczywiście i Watchmen, to co najważniejsze będzie, czyli Watchmen. Zapytam go oczywiście o te trzy tematy, ale także o więcej. Zatem, welcome to the, I didn't tell you the name of the channel is called Beards from Outer Space.
Oh,
it's a very normal name.
Beards?
Yeah.
I've got a little one, I don't know where it came from, but...
So you can be an honorable beard from outer space. So welcome on our channel.
Thank you.
And as I said, like there's a lot of authors, there's a lot of characters that you've worked on. But I want to start at the beginning because you work with such huge individuals, such big characters like Warren Ellis, like Garth Ennis, like Alan Moore. They are really considered being like very strong psychologically. Were they hard to work with?
The thing that I have had the opportunity throughout my career, thankfully I've been around for so long, that I've worked with some of the best writers in the world. And the thing that I find so satisfying is the fact that for me, being in such a small island as Britain, the United Kingdom, we have such talented writers there, as you say, Alan Moore, Garth Ennis. You know, the nice thing is like they're all from different parts. You know, they can be Scottish, Northern Irish, you know, and Alan Moore's is that quintessential Northampton writer. And every one of them, because we all started, I mean, Garth's quite young, but I started around the same time as Alan Moore in particular. And we used to meet up socially. Oh. And that was a great way, one, to get to know someone as a person and a personality. So when we talked about projects or properties that we were going to possibly do, you know, we started off on this the basis of the fact that we enjoyed each other's company. So to work with those guys, and for me, I have to mention John Wagner, who was one of the co-creators of Judge Dredd. And to work with those guys is just such a pleasure, you know, and they are people who I enjoy the company of and conversations with, and even if we didn't work together, I would happily sit and have a beer with them.
So even though there are multitude of some anecdotes about their being strong is a good way, very very subtle way of saying it. You never felt it while working with them there were some very huge artistic differences or something, or pressure, or you argued too much or something like that. You didn't feel it at all?
No, I mean, I think the great thing for me was the fact that they were equal talents. You know, the fact that they've gone on to be, you know, superstars in their particular firmament. At no time did I ever feel that they were trying to dictate to me what they wanted to do. Obviously, they had strong ideas of the story, and obviously, to a certain extent, Watchmen and Killing Joke, they were the ones that's defined to a certain extent Alan, you know. And for me, probably more people know me for colouring the Killing Joke and Watchmen than any other one thing I've done.
Yeah, probably.
And that's not a bad thing to be known for. So yeah, but they've always made suggestions. Every one of them has always had ideas and suggestions, and that's always incorporated into whatever else I was trying to put into that particular story. So it's always been a great collaboration with all those guys.
So were there some quirks of working with them? Did you learn how, if you wanted to push some idea, you knew how to get to any of them?
Well, I just didn't tell them when I changed it. No, they would notice, I think. Sometimes the great thing, no matter how good a writer is, there's only so much they can think of visually.
Yeah.
So the best collaboration is when they have the story to tell, they have the characters to introduce, and once the writer and I have got that right at that particular beginning point, I know who the characters is, and the writers are happy with what I've done, how I've visualised their characters, then they just write the story and they give you complete and utter freedom to do it. The great thing about the difference between Alan Moore and the other writers, you know, Warren Ellis, Garth Ennis, and John Wagner in particular, those last three, I mean, they write in a certain way, whereas Alan writes so much detail that, you know, there's very little wiggle room. Whereas Garth, John, and Warren, they tend to give you a précis at the beginning of the scene. They'll set you all the information where it is, what character's going to be in it, and then it unfolds from there onwards. So They sometimes might suggest close-up, long shot, whatever, but most of the time they leave that to you.
Okay.
And that's the great thing about working with a professional writer. I mean, sometimes there are some writers, and I think to a certain extent, Alan Moore started off the direction of where the people who should be novelists, they think they should be
and
writing
he is
comics.
a novelist.
But they shouldn't. They should be writing prose stories. Alan is one of the only few people who is so visually literate as a writer. He tends to get it right more often than not. So the great thing about, when you trust the artist, as all my collaborators have done, then I do my thing, and then they allow me to do the truth to their story, which is great fun.
And okay, so when the artist gave you a little bit of freedom, like you said a moment ago, you said about like you're probably best known for Watchmen and the Killing Joke. So let's focus for a second just on the Killing Joke, because not only about the story, but it is usually let's say praised for the revolutionary approach to the coloring, and the coloring was, of course, there was a change of coloring, etc. Like, how did you approach it from like for the last 20 years? They redid the coloring, etc. And then you had like a version when you can compare it. How did you look at this whole, let's say, controversy, if you want to call it that?
Well, I think the great thing about Brian sort of like doing his version of the coloring was, I think, and particularly now they did the collector's edition where you have both versions, as you mentioned, you can, I think the comparisons don't necessarily, there should not necessarily be a comparison as such. There should not be a judgment between, do I like that one better than that, or do I like that one better? Because like I did it from the Joker's perspective, my approach, because my natural colouring style is quite striking, I like complementary colours, and unless as in the Watchmen, I had a different brief, my natural colouring style is quite striking. Whereas Brian's, like, when we had a very brief conversation, and he did suggest he wanted a more muted tone, but we didn't really go into it in the detail that Dave Gibbons and Alan Moore and I did with Watchmen. So when I did my version, I just went to town because we had so little time the deadline, the schedule was so tight. I really had to get it right immediately, and my natural style came through, which thankfully is psychedelic and it's like mad and Joker-esque. And so when we see Brian's approach, which is quite very, very muted and very sort of like dark, and he was trying to bring you into sort of like Batman's mindset, shall we say. I think that for me, I just like the 2 points of view, and I think I was talking to some people who do very nicely say to me that they appreciate my version more. But I like sort of like the fact it's like you have the Jokers and the Batmans, and the fact that mine was done 20, 25, 30 years ago, okay, I was first.
And
down for me.
And that's also the perfect explanation, that you can look at both versions, and it's not like someone screwed up here, but there's a method to the madness in both versions.
Very much so.
So this is great, and the artist comes through for.
I mean, I think that's a lovely thing. I mean, if you, as an artist or even as a writer, so like if you describe one scene, or if I draw you, a different artist would draw you differently to where I would. You'd still be recognisable in you, hopefully. But we have 2 different ways of looking at you, and the same if a writer wrote something about you, would take different aspects, and that's the great thing about art. It can be in the eye of the beholder. And the great thing about comics for me is how it's developed since I got into the business. Hopefully if people can go along to the DC exhibition that's on at the moment, they would see the way the art of Batman's developed over the last 50, how many years? 60, 70 years?
He's 80 years old.
80 years, yeah, of course, yeah. So, it really is mind-blowing when you see the approach of the artists in the early days. And it's really striking, because when you look at what Neil Adams and Brian Bolland and Dave Gibbons did with all the different characters, the amount of depth that they put in nowadays, not saying the great artists in the past didn't give it depth, but they gave it a different sort of emphasis. And so the development of artists now is just incredible.
When you say about it, there's another question that arises. Like you talked about the development or the evolution of style. Do you think like just the fact that now you can use more colors because the printers are better, like using computers, etc. Did it change like the art style, coloring, etc. to the better? Did it give you more choices, or did it make it too easier? Do you feel like sometimes the artist can become a little bit lazy?
I think it certainly changed. Digital colour has certainly changed the approach of, certainly the way I approach the colouring of things. When you see some of my favourite colourists like Matt Hollingsworth, who coloured Preacher, and he's regularly goes on to top-notch books for DC mainly. He does Marvel, but it's like mainly DC. And his approach, he'll pick a palette that he particularly wants to approach, whereas I've always like been a more intuitive colourist. The great thing for me is like working on Watchmen was like I was limited by the palette. We only had something like 65 colours that we could use, or tones we could use. So it really limited what I could do, which was great in a way, because that created the colouring that people recognise as Watchmen colouring. I remember it's like when we did the Absolute Edition, I got the opportunity to digitalise the colouring. And it's like I was talking to Dave Gibbons about it, and he was like saying, I thought maybe I should modernise it more, do more fully painted stuff and more tone, more use lots of different colours. And he said, no, leave it exactly the same way it is, just digitalise it and it's like keep the colour palette that I created for Watchmen, and in the 1986, and I was gratified in a number of different ways, because one, that when I look at the Absolute Edition now, which we did in 2005, the colouring for that, I can look at it and say that is Watchmen colouring, and even the old traditional colouring from 1986, the two books, one is digital and looks clean and finished and tonal and nice and neat, and the original stuff, even though the colours are similar, it's quite brutal, hard-edged, and quite
but
cutting.
Doesn't it better work with Watchmen? Like think of hard, brutal. It's like thinking about Watchmen. So isn't the new version making it more polished and more like restricted in a way, in a weird way?
Well, that was the interesting thing was because Dave decided he wanted it to be very similar to what we did originally. It was actually quite satisfying not to sort of like start messing around with things that work so perfectly. So if one scene worked incredibly well, there's no need to sort of like for me to rethink what I'd gotten right. There's some elements that I would have done slightly differently if I'd had the digital aspect, 35 years ago. But thankfully, I wasn't given the opportunity, and because of the limitations, it worked perfectly, I think.
And do you have like second thoughts about some of your albums, some of your work from 30, 20 years ago? You think, now I could do this differently, or you even like have some comics that you want to do once again, you want to do in a different way?
I think that's a really, really good question, and I think before I saw Brian's recolouring of Batman, I would have actually thought, I think I would like to start on some aspects of my original work from 20, 30 years ago when I first started in the business. But because of seeing what Brian did, he's just changed it. He didn't improve it per se, he just changed it. And I feel like Alan Moore made a comment when someone asked him about it, what do you think about the new colouring? He says, what's the point? It was the original book was done and the original colouring was done in 1989, whatever. Why modernise it now? What's the point? It's a classic story, and that's the way it should stay. And once I heard people talking about it from that aspect, it made sense to me. It's pointless going back and changing things that was like started off in such and such a way and creates its own time and place. And if it stands up to scrutiny 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, then you're very satisfied that you got it right right in the beginning. Dave was really interesting because there's a couple of things that he wanted to. He thought if he ever went back to Watchmen, he would change. I won't point out these things. Dave did point out to me one or two things, and maybe the readers can go and look very, very closely at Watchmen.
Oh.
But Dave sort of decided to keep the original, not mistakes, but the original version in place rather than like do something and modernise it now, just because he's got 35 years of hindsight. So yeah, no, I completely. That's a really interesting question. I was very fortunate. A couple of years ago, I got the opportunity to have a retrospective exhibition in my hometown of Liverpool, and the artwork goes back obviously all through my career, which did start in 1977, which is unbelievable. I'm still around, still being able to think cogently.
But you're still younger than Batman. So.
Thank you. Yes. And I looked at this artwork. The curator puts it into context in a way that you don't your own work. You know, a curator is someone who will actually put it in a context that I never saw there was that sequence of ways of looking at my artwork. And I relearned so much by someone else's presentation of my work. And I've discovered renewed enthusiasm for doing. I've got new. It was really funny actually, because one of the people I worked with in Liverpool, she was born and bred in Woods. She's a Polish designer, and now she's living in Liverpool, and she works for a company called Kaleidoscope. So Mylena, if you ever hear this online, you will sort of like, I miss her 'cause she was here this weekend, and we didn't quite connect. But she helped me develop the sort of visual approach to what we were trying to present with the exhibition. And it was just a labour of love working with like some very talented people and one very talented Polish lady and the curators at the VG&M gallery in Liverpool. So it's just been a real. And actually, Mylena and someone else from the company interviewed me. And I sort of like used this word, which was I got like renewed vigour. It's like Viagra for the artist. And she thought that was quite amusing.
Yeah,
so.
Viagra for the art is great. So did you do the exhibition about the Great Fire and the post stamps later?
That's right. Yes.
And how this idea came about to put a historical story on stamps in a comic book form?
I know, it's brilliant, wasn't it? I wish I thought of it.
It's such a great idea. So how did you approach it? It was such a different thing. It's not, you cannot look at it as a comic book, but still it has to be comic-y. How did you do it?
I think that's a great thing. That's like I know people who appreciate comics like yourself and our viewers. Is we realise how we can use comics to inform people. You don't need to sort of like have words. You don't need to have sort of like if you tell a proper story with a beginning, middle, and an end, which is what the design. I work very closely with a different set of designers for the comics version of the stamps, and they had to plan out like through the map of where the fire started and where the fire ended. So that's the way the story unfolded. And the designers were just so very, very clever to actually come up with that concept. And the nice thing for me, knowing sort of like visually what we can do and what we can sort of like impart into, these are tiny little frames.
Yeah, but they were big on the exhibition.
The exhibition was very, very big. But it was really interesting. I found it really fascinating. And for me, as like an artist, one of the problems we have as a sort of, a working hack, should we say. We try and do the best work we can, but there's always a deadline, there's always a tight schedule. It's never ever as much input as you would particularly like, because the deadline detects otherwise. So to actually get a little bit of a larger project and spend a lot longer doing it, if I'd have been doing that for a comic book, I would have finished in a week. Because I was doing it for a very high profile project, it was something like 3 to 4 months to do was it 4 stamps or 6 stamps?
6 stamps. 6
and
stamps.
probably only about probably 24 frames.
Yeah.
You know, so that's not even half a scene in a book. So it was great fun to actually have that sort of like approach to doing something. You were talking earlier about collaborating with writers.
Yeah.
And one of the things I enjoy most about like doing what I do, it is teamwork. And the lovely thing about dealing with other talented people is the fact that the input they give you hopefully improves what I bring to the game as well.
Yeah.
And it's such a great adrenaline rush to sort of like think that's a creative person, they want this done, I need to like up my game. I just love it. It's like you guys working, it's like, interviewing me, trying to get the best out of me, get my best side visually. So yeah, it's a collaboration.
And the best ideas. So my last question, basically, after 30 years, this is a question probably you've been asked many times. After so many years of working, have there been a character or a story that you really like felt that you are connected with it and you love writing, drawing, coloring, whatever, like working on it, that you can say after so many years, she, or the story is close to my heart and I really love her, it.
I think I have just been incredibly lucky to be involved with Watchmen, Killing Joke, Judge Dredd, John Constantine for DC, and some of the other projects, Pride and Joy. Now I'm going to do the whole list of my career now. There's so many, working with Garth Ennis as a writer, it's like he's just one of my favourite collaborators. One, because we're still working on things together now. But there's so many projects that I've really enjoyed working on. But probably for me, because the great thing about like, I've been around so long, a lot of my works have been collected together in collected editions and been reprinted around the world. And because of what's happening in the world politics generally, like Britain and America, and we don't need to mention Brexit or Trump, but funny enough, I just did. I hope you're going to bleep that out. So
no.
Filter in my lips or something. But there's a series in 2000 AD called Democracy.
Oh, yeah.
And it was about, the fascism and the totalitarian with the judge regime. And, it's the fact that like a fascist judge and, society can be so entertaining, which is because John Wagner and other great writers now are starting to collaborate and work on that particular character. But for me, the Democracy series I did with John Wagner is probably one of my favourite series. And it is still relevant. And the great thing about science fiction is the fact that if you set it, 100 years in the future, is it recognisable? If you set it 10 minutes in the future or 50 years in the future, then it's recognisable. I mean, 2000 AD, how many 2019, 2019 and 2000 AD still looks like the future.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's hilarious. But yeah, I mean, there's some relevance. And working with collaborate with John Wagner on the Democracy series, Judge Dredd, I'd actually just got to the stage where I was starting to understand what the character could do facially and visually, and just get the entity in the way I did it, rather than like doing it similar to another great artist, which we have here at the Comics Festival, who's Mick McMahon.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, and he's a great artist, and he was one of the originators of the style and design of, along with Brian Bolden and Carlson Square, of the way Judge Dredd looks. And once I'd got from out of the shadow of those guys to a certain extent, I was starting to put my interpretation on Dredd. And that was when I actually started saying, this is my Dredd rather than someone else's Dredd. So that, probably the Democracy series.
So, thank you. This is a great ending, by the way, because using the Democracy and how beautifully science fiction tells us about our everyday struggles. But at the end of each interview with my guest, who is not from here, I ask them one little tiny favor, just to say hello to our viewers, but in Polish.
All right.
So it's witajcie na brodach z kosmosu, and I even wrote it down. So to make it, I'm not sure if it's going to make it easier.
Witajcie na brodzie z kosmosu.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now I'm switching to Polish for a second. Dziękuję za wywiad, Wam oczywiście dziękuję za obejrzenie i zapraszam do subskrybowania. Jeżeli macie jakieś pytanie, do komentarzy, jeżeli chcecie wrzucić napisy, ja nie zrobię napisów, więc też komentujcie. I would like to thank you once again for the whole interview, and we'll see each other, I hope so, on Beards from Outer Space.
Thank you, I appreciate it.